the sun never set on the British Empire. But the shadows were lengthening. As we continue tracing our journey through the story of St. George and how England came to see itself as it now does, we reach the eve of the 20th century. Britain seemed untouchable, yet the myths that once bound the nation were fraying. Since the monarchy's restoration, England's identity had remained hollowed out. Mary and George faded from prominence. The divine right of kings was broken, and St. George's cross gave way to the Union Jack. Symbols that once anchored the nation, mother, father, king, and country, had each become shadows of what they once were. Into that void stepped a new flag bearer, Britannia, a figure of allegory rather than faith. The martyr had been replaced, but his spirit never left. England still had a dragon to face, and it wouldn't be long before it reared its head once more. As the Great War loomed, Britain seemed unshakable in its imperial might. But the world it ruled was changing faster than it could possibly fathom. With the Union's foundations buckling while restless powers stirred in Europe, an unbridled parliament propelled Britain into a century that would test every story the empire ever told. But before we faced the roar of the guns, how did it come to this? How did a nation forged by kings and crusades come to see itself neither in the crown nor the cross, but in war without glory, sent to factories and front lines by voices and images that carried further than swords could ever reach? The answer doesn't begin on the battlefield. It begins in the halls of Westminster, where the myth of England and of Britain was quietly being rewritten. Long before the chaos of the trenches, long before empire defined Britain's place in the world, England had already been carving its foundations for centuries, through shifting loyalties and broken altars, through dethroned kings and rising voices that echoed in halls once reserved for nobility. The crisis of 1914 emerged onto a stage already set. For England, it was the culmination of a long struggle to decide who would steer the nation's course: the crown, the church, or the people. In part 2, we saw the English Reformation as the crest of a long-rising Protestant tide, diverting spiritual authority from church hierarchy to the individual. In part 3, we saw the monarchy's power in decline, not caused by the Civil War, just another wave that finally had to break. Because to understand how Britain entered the First World War with Parliament at the helm and England's old myths fading, we need to trace the centuries-old story of a nation claiming power for its people. From the Witan of Anglo-Saxon times to the Magna Carta of 1215, England repeatedly tested the limits of royal power, and that struggle would long continue. The provisions of Oxford forced Henry III to accept a council that challenged not only his authority, but also the Pope who backed him. This defiance led to the introduction of elected commoners in Simon de Montfort's Parliament of 1265, and though short-lived, his experiment provided a template for Edward I's model parliament 30 years later, which guaranteed clergy, nobles, knights and burgesses a seat at the table. Rule was now grounded in a principle radical for its age: what touches all should be approved by all. By the time Edward III named St. George England's patron, the idea of a shared national identity, rooted in virtues like courage and duty, was beginning to take hold. In that spirit, the Commons started to assert their growing authority with the first ever impeachment of corrupt royal ministers, an act that was far ahead of its time. These moments of bravery, when the people stood face to face with rulers, were about more than power. They were about a valour belonging as much to the people as to kings, knights, and the saint who embodied them all. The people were finding their voice. But change was coming. Parliament's newfound boldness would pale against the sweeping reforms of the Commonwealth, a regime that went so far as to ban saints altogether, saints whose imagery had come to stand for kingship and Catholic faith alike. The revolutionaries wanted to see an end to both, and while their victory was fleeting in the broader arc of English history, the knock-on effects proved irreversible. Ever since the monarchy's return in 1660, royal power remained weakened. Parliament now controlled the purse and the military, while Charles II, seeking their backing, promised cooperation through the Declaration of Breda, yet another step towards a new balance of power. It was still a partnership, but now the monarch stood on the back foot. And the push wouldn't end there. In the decades that followed, the Glorious Revolution and 1701's Act of Settlement cemented the shift. Monarchs could no longer declare war, or even leave the country without approval. Control had moved decisively from the throne to the Commons. One comparison makes the new landscape particularly clear. Under the new legislation, the monarch could no longer appoint foreigners to office, but Parliament could appoint foreigners to the throne. George I, who barely spoke English and continued to spend most of his time in Germany, delegated authority as he took up his royal title over an unfamiliar land. In the resulting vacuum, the reins of power still demanded a steady hand, someone to lead in the absence of a decisive head of state. And so it was that Robert Walpole stepped forward to take command as the first de facto leader of government. The precedent was set, and the office of Prime Minister was here to stay. Where monarchs once ruled for decades, leadership now turned on the ever-changing tides of parliamentary manoeuvring and public expectation. By Victoria's reign, that office had become the true seat of power, ushering in a revolving door of prime ministers, an incredible 33 during her lifetime. The monarchy could no longer impose its will, and the electorate, amplified by the press, had become a force to be reckoned with. Even as the stories of duty remained, by now, the sovereign could only observe, more public servant than ruling power. And so the pieces were in position, and the framework that Parliament had built for centuries was about to face its greatest trial. Control now rested chiefly with elected officials, turning governance from birthright into a never-ending contest of strategy and persuasion. And as Edward VII made way for a wartime George V, this modern constitutional reality placed the real work of leading the country firmly in the hands of Prime Ministers Asquith and Lloyd George. A new order had emerged, but it needed more than just authority to carry the nation. What Parliament built in law and governance, Britain still had to sustain in spirit. The throne and the Dragon Slayer's cross had been replaced by Westminster and the Union Jack. Britannia's empire did indeed rule the waves, yet in England, St George still haunted the national imagination, folded into Britannia's broader myth, where valour now served dominion rather than faith. But soon, this fusion of heroism and imperial duty would also be put to the test. The Great War would force England to confront everything it thought it knew, the meaning of courage and of sacrifice, and in the process, to reckon with the symbols that once stood for those values. St George lingered as an emblem, but he had not returned with the exiled line. His day and his meaning seemed all but forgotten, and before England's warrior could once more fight alongside his people, they first had to remember him. By the end of the Victorian age, the cultural revival we saw in the last video had rekindled a vision of England's medieval past. But what artists and dreamers revived in symbol was only part of a larger movement, one that had yet to take root in public life, and one bound closely to the fate of the saint himself. This too was far from a sudden awakening. St George's long journey from obscurity back to national symbol had begun centuries earlier. Cast aside by the Puritans of the 17th century, he lay largely dormant throughout the Restoration and early Hanoverian reigns. Yet slowly, England's warrior saint was returning, ready to reclaim his place in the nation's heart. At first, the signs were faint, little more than gesture. In 1789, George III acknowledged St George's Day for the first and only time, marking his recovery from mental collapse. True recognition would begin with his son, George IV. He declared the 23rd of April his official birthday, and in his namesake's honour, founded the Order of St Michael and St George, embedding England's patron saint once more in the state, and subtly linking him to Britain's expanding Mediterranean presence. For the first time in generations, the saint was not merely remembered, he was used. By the Victorian era, St George had begun a cautious public return. Military parades, church services, and formal dinners marked the day, though enthusiasm was far from even. Among the working classes and a small devoted elite, he remained, while for much of the middle and upper classes, his name barely registered, a whisper of patriotism drowned out by the roar of empire. As one writer observed back in 1882, another passage from the St George's Day article we encountered in the last video, the divide was striking. The lower classes have, from the sheer love of a holiday, clung to him with a certain amount of fidelity, but amongst the higher classes, it is doubtful if, but for his appearance on the coinage and on the Order of the Garter, he would be remembered at all. But in the years that followed, the public mood was shifting. What had begun as an aesthetic revival was now becoming institutional. Deliberate, organised efforts emerged. John Ruskin's Guild of St George called for a return to pre-industrial English life, while new civic bodies supplied the means that turned patriotic sentiment into practice. St George's Day became a stage for royal events, troop inspections and society gatherings, led by the newly founded Royal Society of St George, whose aim was simple: to remind England of its national figurehead, its hero, and perhaps most of all, its mythic self. The Daily Telegraph pressed the point. Let this day be more and more every year cultivated and celebrated as the name day and festival of England, and hold in mind today not the Empire, not the United Kingdom, not this or that outlying corner or fringe of the realm, but England herself, the predominant partner. Quite the call to arms, and even the quiet hand of administration played its part. Revival was no longer purely sentimental. It was at last becoming procedural. But at a time of such confidence and innovation, why did it even matter to the generations that saw this through? Beneath these efforts to restore the day lay something else, something deeper. The English were seeking more than tradition. They were seeking an identity that seemed to have slipped away, obscured by progress, absorbed by the Union, overshadowed by the vastness of empire. By the early 20th century, St George was no longer just a knight or a patron saint. He was once more becoming shorthand for English pluck and duty, a figure the nation would summon again as it confronted the trials of the Great War. But at the same time, England was not alone in this search for self. Across the Union, other nations pressed their own claims. Ireland, most of all. The empire might have projected strength abroad, but at home, within the Union, tension was mounting. Where England searched for a symbol, Ireland fought for a voice. For centuries it had been treated as a subordinate partner, ruled, taxed and policed from afar. British landlords extracted high rents, famine hollowed out communities, and when debts rose, the evictions came. Conditions had grown desperate, while at the same time, native identity was being ever more suppressed. The Irish language forced out of schools, folklore sidelined, and public life reshaped to suit British norms. Westminster offered representation on paper, but little deciding power, and as the prospect of home rule gathered momentum, the possibility of partition threatened Britain's self-image as a stable, united kingdom. By the 1880s, reform no longer satisfied. Full sovereignty was the demand. In such a climate, every symbol mattered. Flags, festivals, and cultural expressions became battlegrounds, each one asserting a nation's right to define itself. And across the Irish Sea, the contrast was striking. England's own symbols, St Patrick's knightly counterpart among them, remained muted, ceremonial at best, hints of an identity crisis yet to be fully acknowledged. Nowhere was this contrast clearer than in the British military itself. Irish soldiers wore the shamrock freely on St Patrick's Day, a badge of pride nobody thought to question. English regiments, by comparison, were tightly restricted by precedent. Only the Northumberland Fusiliers could display the rose on St George's Day, having sought formal approval. The irony was unmistakable. In Ireland, national identity had to be fought for and was displayed without apology. In England, sovereignty was assumed, but its symbols barely spoken. Together, these parallel struggles revealed a deeper truth. Britain's unity was far more fragile than its stiff upper lip suggested. Beneath the image of a confident global power lay competing loyalties, unresolved histories, and identities pulling in different directions. Britain stood astride the world, but the strain was already showing, and the storm, in earnest, had yet to break. Ireland wasn't the only fault line. Trouble was brewing beyond Britain's shores, out of direct sight, but no less volatile. For generations, Britain had comforted itself with a story that the empire was the outward proof of a nation confident in its unity and moral purpose. But as the 20th century approached, that story too began to fray. From schoolrooms in Delhi to outposts in Africa, the imperial project was presented as destiny. Railway maps and flags unfurled like signatures of progress. From London, the machinery of government reached across continents. All the while, behind the confident facade, it rested on a vision of Britishness that was becoming harder to believe in. Westminster dictated trade, law, and the rhythms of daily life in far-flung colonies, imprinting fragments of its identity wherever bureaucracy reached. And, as with Ireland, the grand spectacle concealed contradiction, a moral unease the Victorians struggled to silence. The Second Boer War shattered Britain's self-image, scorched earth, civilian camps, and a brutal conflict that exposed the gap between the story Britain still told about itself and the reality unfolding on the ground. Resistance spread across the empire. Indian Swadeshi campaigns, West African political dissent, Caribbean opposition to forced labour, each one a reminder that the assumed consent on which British authority rested was slipping. And it's not difficult to see why. Even as Britain exported infrastructure and parliamentary systems empowering subjugated peoples in theory, it imposed its own hierarchy and coercion in practice. My point here isn't that the empire was all bad, just conflicted, and at times profoundly misjudged, pulled between lofty ideals and brutal reality. And the progress the story told wasn't illusion. Britain's presence carried undeniable advances in law, medicine, sanitation, education and agriculture, saving, sustaining and improving countless lives. Even at the height of its power, Britain chose to outlaw slavery wherever it ruled, pressuring other empires to follow suit. For many Britons, this felt like a genuine civilizing mission. And in a sense, it often was. But in the colonies, that distinction meant little. Rule was still foreign and power still imposed. This was the empire's paradox, both a stabilizer and spark, saviour and oppressor. And at the heart of it lay a question that grew sharper every year. If Britishness was now an imperial idea, whose identity was it describing? England had already partly dissolved into the Union, blended with Scotland, Wales and Ireland, but those ties meant something. It was an extended family of sorts, sharing geography, history and blood across millennia, a shared identity rooted in local reality. The empire, by contrast, demanded a far more impersonal allegiance, no shared culture, no common ancestry, no closely connected history. Britishness was no longer the identity born of a natural coalition, but an idea, a fledgling ideology, a new worldview, one that was becoming increasingly detached from the reality on the ground. So, given this, what really drove the imperial project? Was it power, profit, pride? In truth, beneath the soaring ideals and civilizing slogans lay something Britain rarely admitted, something far more pragmatic and far more uneasy. For a small island off the coast of Europe surrounded by imperial giants, the British Empire was much more than a projection of strength. It was a strategy for survival. Britain had never known true security. Neighbour to a fractious continent, throughout its history it had faced repeated invasion by Romans, Saxons, Vikings and Normans. Over time they wove themselves into the nation's fabric, but they exposed a weakness. England, and Britain more broadly, carried the scars of foreign swords, faiths and empires, and that vulnerability ran deep. By Henry III, the Pope had already shown how easily overseas influence could sway English politics, and by the early modern era the country stood isolated, Protestant in a Catholic world, estranged from Rome, surrounded by giants. Spain ruled the seas, France commanded Europe's largest army, and the Ottomans loomed in the east. To be English was, increasingly, to feel besieged on all sides. The empire then did not arise from self-confidence, it emerged from anxiety, and England's fragility soon became Britain's purpose. By projecting power outward, Britain sought not just dominion, but above all, defence. Colonies served as buffers, trade routes were lifelines, and naval bases from Gibraltar to the Cape formed the steel edge of Britannia's shield. India was her shining jewel and vital linchpin in the east, while far-flung territories like Canada, Australia and Singapore became integral links in a global barricade, all of it to protect the tiny island at the heart of a vast empire. And over time this network took on a kind of spiritual weight. Britain came to see itself as more than just a world power. It was the steward of peace, a keystone in the grand vision of global order. In this light, the empire became not only necessary, but noble. Who else, after all, would keep the peace with such a fair hand? Who else would bring progress, if not the cradle of the Industrial Revolution? But myths of this scale demand constant upkeep. Upkeep demands resources. Resources demand reach. And by the 19th century, as rival empires surged, France in Africa, Russia towards India, Germany rising fast, Britain's reach had to stretch ever further. As it did, every rebellion, every trade dispute, every chink in the chain became an existential test, not just for the empire, but for Britain itself. It still called itself a peacekeeper, but what began as strategy became a growing burden. By the eve of the First World War, Britain's empire stood at its height. Global, imposing, and dangerously overstretched. The little island was in over its head. It shouldered the weight of the world, and now that world was growing restless. Now, the political landscape leading up to the First World War is far too vast to cover in detail, and this video and this series are not about cataloguing every diplomatic thread. They're about following England's identity through the symbol of St. George into the modern age. So from here, the story steps once more into the symbolic, a tragedy in the classical mould, played out through figures we met in the last video, and the grand narratives that drove Europe towards a war of almost mythic proportions. Britannia, as we've seen, may have commanded the seas, but across the Channel, while England wrestled with its past and its place on the world stage, rivals were assembling their own champions. The great powers entered the 20th century draped in classical finery, each with its own divine muse. Britannia stood watchful in the west, shielded by treaties, bound to France and Russia not by trust, but by necessity, a cautious pact to contain rising threats. Beside her, Marianne, France's revolutionary spirit, burned with liberty while bearing loss. Alsace-Lorraine still bled in her memory, her sons training for the day it would be reclaimed from Prussian hands. Far to the east loomed an unlikely ally, Rodina, Mother Russia, the face of a people older than Tsars or the Orthodox cross she bore. Her embrace could comfort or crush. She had birthed empires, buried invaders, and now, even as famine stalked her fields, she too armed her sons, vowing to defend her Slavic kin. On her borders, the double-headed eagle of Austria-Hungary circled above a crumbling empire. Regal but weary, its wings stretched too far, its gaze torn between east and west, while on the ground below, whispers spread in a dozen tongues. Serbs, Czechs, Bosnians, dreaming of borders not yet drawn. Its cousin, the Prussian eagle, rose in a new guise, reborn as Germania, a titan of steel flanked by a Kaiser wrought in Caesar's image. Once divided, now united, industrial, disciplined, and growing impatient, her Wagnerian cry thundered of a Germany destined to stand among the ancients. Meanwhile, to the south, where Caesars once reigned, Italia stood crowned with towers, poised at the crossroads of nationhood and empire. Newly united, fragile, caught between old loyalties and new ambitions. Her ancient crown was both promise and question amid restless neighbours. Last, estranged from her sisters far across the ocean, Columbia, the twin of Lady Liberty, looked on. She believed herself an outsider, young, idealistic, and sceptical of old ghosts. And while untouched by Europe's feuds, she too watched and weighed, trading with empires, preaching peace, but quietly preparing, for when the blood began to flow, she would not remain distant. These were not gods of the people, but avatars of empire. And behind them all, Roma, mother of empires, whispered from the ruins, calling her daughters to glory once more. To each she spoke a prophecy. Britannia, you are the last shield of civilization. Keep the flame. Marianne, my heart, reborn in liberty, wounded, you shall rise again. Germania, you are the new Caesar, fated to eclipse all others. Rodina, too old to forgive, too young to forget, reclaim what is yours, Byzantium's heir. Italia, choose wisely, my kin. You stand between nation and empire. Columbia, my daughter in exile, my final experiment. Do not look away when the fire comes. And to the weary eagle still soaring overhead, you are my memory. You alone remember how empires ruled. Each heard what they wished to hear, Each believed themselves the true heir. Each armed themselves accordingly. The gods would not clash in the heavens, but through mortal hands. Armies gathered, pawns marching towards the fortunes of emperors, not knowing their laurels were already drenched in blood. The Triple Alliance braced against the Triple Entente. Treaties no longer safeguards, but loaded triggers. The powder keg was packed and primed, and as clouds gathered over Europe, every shadowed capital, every gilded hall seemed to wait for the invisible hand that would tilt the world. Playthings in a game of gods. From this height, it seemed the nations were less betrayed by each other than by the legacy they all claimed, by the dream of Rome, a serpent that had not vanished, merely changed its skin. As the titans of Europe armed for war, St. George too would be called again. Only this time, the dragon did not meet him on an open field. It would find him in the trenches. By 1914, the gods had made their moves. Now the men made theirs. Sarajevo, the 28th of June. A wrong turn. 2 shots from the crowd. The Archduke slumps, his wife falls beside him, and the world veers irreversibly off course. All it took was a spark. Small, human, a moment's chance, but what followed was no longer human. Ferdinand's death awakened something greater. International law, alliances, treaties, inked and signed across centuries, moved like gears set in motion long before the first men marched. Telegrams flew, mobilizations snapped into place. It had been a long time coming, but when war arrived, the soldiers on the ground faced a new reality. No rolling hills, no gallant combat, only mud, wire, and death on an industrial scale. Machine guns swept battlefields clean. Trenches, once a last resort, became grim, waterlogged arteries, permanent homes for the wounded and the waiting. Artillery rained destruction. Gas masks became lifelines. Every breath a gamble, as poison clouds choked and blinded the unprepared. And by 1916, beyond the sodden banks, the landscape of war had become a mechanized nightmare. Tanks clanked into view, massive treads clawing at the earth. Aircraft evolved from eyes in the sky into winged hunters. Even the oceans became deadly, littered with mines, stalked by submarines that lurked beneath the waves. Land, sky, and sea had become instruments of destruction, moving in uncanny coordination. In this new arena of combat, one question remained. Could the archetype of the warrior still survive? Back in England, far from the front lines, in schoolbooks and ceremonies, echoes of St. George persisted. The shining knight, the noble steed, the dragon slayer. On the battlefields of Europe, that image crumbled. The knight, now a mud-slick private, dying beside men he barely knew. The steed had bolted, trapped in wire, abandoned to shells and gunfire. And the dragon? Here, myth collided with reality. From torn ground, twisted wire, and smoke clawing at the sky, it took shape. A fire-breathing beast of war, born not of flesh, but conflict itself. A living shadow of smoke and steel. To the soldier of 1914, war was unrecognizable. A grinding engine of destruction, fed on the faceless slaughter of countless men. In its wake, courage made way for survival. Glory turned to ash. How did the clash of steel and the dull thunder of hooves fade so swiftly into distant memory? The arms race had always been more of a marathon than a sprint. From the age of armoured knights to the trenches of the First World War, time and again the rules of battle had been rewritten. At Agincourt, knights rode through fog and drizzle, the eerie whistle of arrows and the sickening thud as they struck steel and flesh. Then came gunpowder. Sudden flashes, the crack of hand cannons, plate, shield and chainmail rendered obsolete in the white haze. Stone walls were razed to rubble like sandcastles swept away by the rising tide of bombard fire. By the early modern era, muskets fired in unison, volleys ripping the air, smoke settling like a shroud over the fallen. Formations broke and cavalry faltered as artillery pounded the lines. But what came next would render all of it little more than naive memory. The industrial age arrived with a world-shattering paradigm of war. Rifles replaced muskets. Steamships and railroads redefined distance. Breech loaders and machine guns shifted the focus from individual valor to overwhelming firepower and relentless production. Unflinching grit mattered far less than supply lines, speed, and industrial capacity. All the while, through each transformation, from blade to bullet, from charge to shell, the image of the warrior changed. The knight became the soldier, the duel became the front, and the myths of glory. By the dawn of the 20th century, warfare had become a logistical hurricane of numbers and strategic attrition that left honour and glory behind in the mud. Death was no longer a moment of noble courage or sacrifice. It was random, faceless, invisible. One moment a soldier breathed, the next he was gone, taken by a shell he could never have seen coming. No final stand, no duel of destinies, just chance. A gear breaks, a letter never arrives. Yet even as these new incarnations of warfare devoured men and reshaped the battlefield, stories of valour persisted. St. George may have seemed quaint, outdated, a relic of a simpler age, but soldiers still whispered his tales of dragons and heroes. The world had changed, but the need for symbols had not. And the machine was all too aware. While the grim reality of the battlefield stripped war of its romance, another battle was being waged at home, in the minds of those left behind. It was a struggle to capture the soldier's spirit, to turn myth and symbol into tools for victory. Since the mid-19th century, the rise of early mass media had made influence immediate and far-reaching like never before. Newspapers, posters, speeches and film became weapons in their own right, shaping the story the nation was willing to believe. Words once confined to Westminster could be read in Yorkshire by morning, speeches repeated, reprinted and absorbed by millions. 2 years into the war, by 1916, this mattered more than ever. The power of the new media landscape collided directly with political leadership. Asquith's quiet, legalistic style had never captured the public imagination, but Lloyd George stepped into the spotlight instinctively. His urgency, his language, and his image gave weight to every headline. In a nation hungry for direction, he became more than just a head of government. He was a living symbol of Britain's determination to win the war. Illustrated articles brought the war home in bold, vivid depictions. In Britain's darkened cinemas, moving pictures like the Battle of the Somme blurred the line between record and persuasion, turning snapshots from the front lines into a shared, if carefully curated, experience. Symbols had always shaped public feeling, but never on such a scale or with such deliberate coordination. From slogans to speeches, official messages flowed through the same channels that carried the Prime Minister's voice, binding government and propaganda into a single apparatus of influence. And so symbolic language became a tool of statecraft, preparing the ground for the more organised efforts that would follow. At the start of the war, few nations had formal propaganda officers. Messaging was instinctive, rooted in appeals to heroics, duty and loyalty. But as the war dragged on, instinct evolved into strategy. Britain's Wellington House, later the Ministry of Information, enlisted writers like Conan Doyle and Kipling, along with artists and filmmakers, to craft a compelling national story. Under Lloyd George, these efforts intensified, harnessing emotion itself. The result was propaganda that was targeted, highly symbolic, and incredibly effective. World War I didn't just mobilise armies, it now mobilised will. And long before the next war, governments had learned a crucial lesson. You don't just fight battles, you shape belief. By the end of the war, propaganda had evolved into whole categories of persuasion, each tapping into the same ancient instincts that once sent knights charging into battle. There was belonging, appeals to unity, to being part of a group. Fear, not just of battle, but of invasion, dishonour, being left behind. Shame and guilt weaponized social pressure and silent accusation. Pride and honour glorifying sacrifice and service. Desire, the promise of admiration, romance, legacy. Righteousness, the simple reassurance of good versus evil. And purpose, the need to be useful, to matter, to mean something. Each message was different, but they all drew on three simple emotional drives. Survival, which forced action. Aspiration, which gave that action meaning. And most importantly, identity. Before anyone could frame the enemy, they had to define who we were. As Roger Scruton famously pointed out, every society rests on that we, a shared identity. And by 1914 in England, even that had begun to blur. The throne itself was not immune. Blood had once been enough to bind Europe's crowns together. Britain's German lines still bore familiar names: Edward, George, echoes of home. But were they us? The Kaiser and the King were family, both descended from Queen Victoria, George V of Britain and Wilhelm II of Germany, cousins, as was Tsar Nicholas II of Russia, so alike in appearance to Britain's king that they practically looked like the same man. And as the Tsars of Russia faced a growing uprising, the same threat loomed in the minds of a British monarchy, long aware that symbols could strengthen or fracture allegiance. By the start of the war, blood bound them only to suspicion. The English spirit, dignified, civilized, yet not easily ruled, demanded careful stewardship from those who dared rule over it. In 1917, caution won. Saxe-Coburg-Gotha became Windsor, a name rooted in English stone and legend, tied to the castle that housed St. George's Chapel. Blood ties gave way to a claim over something older, safer, and unmistakably English. And the very bloodline that bound them to the continent would soon be tested by war. On the 30th of July 1914, George V sent a telegram to another cousin, Prince Henry of Prussia, urging him to use his influence with the Kaiser to stave off disaster. My government is doing its utmost. I trust William will use his great influence to induce Austria to accept this proposal, thus proving that Germany and England are working together to prevent what would be an international catastrophe. Just hours earlier, Nicholas II sent his own plea. I foresee that very soon I shall be overwhelmed by the pressure forced upon me and be forced to take extreme measures which will lead to war. I beg you in the name of our old friendship to do what you can to stop your allies from going too far. Here were men who once exchanged nicknames: Georgie, Willie, Nicky, now powerless before the machinery of empire they were said to command. No longer leaders at all, they had become little more than tragic figureheads of nations defined through opposition. Meanwhile, politicians who championed power for the people turned a generation of boys and men into sacrificial chess pieces, moved at will by those who had built the war from behind desks. Were they us? The line between us and them grew thinner each day, but the juggernaut of persuasion rolled on. The chaos of war flattened into modern myth, forcing the world into simple terms of right and wrong, hero and monster. The brave British Tommy, the monstrous Hun. In this war, every symbol had to choose a side. Names, saints, flags, none were neutral anymore. And alongside them, the familiar icons returned. Britannia, cloaked in the Union Jack, and St. George, the Dragon Slayer, once more invoked as protector of the realm. But St. George didn't belong to England alone. Centuries after the Reformation put an end to England's veneration of saints, Orthodox Russia still held him sacred, long revered as patron of Moscow, proudly emblazoned on the city's coat of arms. Like in England, his martial ties gave him a special reputation within the military, with the Order of St. George and the Crosses of St. George among the very highest of honours for bravery. Even at the outset of the First World War, Russian icons of the saint were still carried into battle for protection, until the 1917 revolution erased this sacred tradition in an instant, a dramatic turning point in Europe's march towards secular modernity. In Germany, St. George's martial legacy endured through medieval orders like the Teutonic Knights and the Bavarian Order of St. George, now fused in propaganda with modern militarism. Iron crosses and rigid discipline combined to inspire sometimes fanatical devotion. Where England's knight turned inward, questioning and fallible, the German knight turned outward, wielding absolute conviction, heroism without doubt, faith fueled for conquest. A different breed of warrior, ready to surge in moments of national crisis. Medieval icons like the Arthurian Red Knights, fearsome rivals to the Knights of the Round Table, found new life in figures such as the Red Baron, a modern embodiment of the same relentless martial ideal. If such symbols could be claimed and reshaped abroad, what did they mean for the scattered peoples of the British Empire? Propaganda promised clarity, but the world it sought to define remained chaotic. Could it weave these disparate voices into a single narrative, even as colonial tensions, cultural differences and unrest threatened to tear it apart? The myth of unity was easy to print, but far harder to find on the ground. For soldiers recruited from India, Africa and the Caribbean, loyalty was often demanded and inconsistently rewarded. Imperial propaganda cast the conflict as a shared sacrifice, not just for Britain, but for the entire empire. A force bound together as much by imagery as by policy. And at the front, the promise thinned. Many found their loyalty unacknowledged, their sacrifice taken for granted. Posters urged them to fight for a distant king and country, and in the trenches, they met suspicion, language barriers, and the same brutal conditions as everyone else. On the eve of St. George's Day, the 22nd of April 1915, French colonial troops from Algeria and Morocco came face to face with something no imperial slogan could prepare them for. They were among the first ever victims of a large-scale chlorine gas attack. A chilling chapter we'll return to soon, and a grim reflection of Empire's supposed glory. It was a far cry from the vision of duty painted by recruiting officers. Across the Western Front and beyond, soldiers experienced the war through the lens of their own identities, as dashed hopes of reform and autonomy fueled nationalist unrest. In 1916, as British troops bled in France, Irish rebels launched the Easter Rising. In Nyasaland, Chilembwe's rebellion broke out. In Singapore and Punjab, mutinies and revolutionary movements exposed the fragility of imperial cohesion. Propaganda promised unity, the empire delivered strain. And yet, as Britain tried to hold its own against enemies across continents, the tensions witnessed in the trenches and across its fractious territories were the latest expression of a pattern that had long defined the nation since the Reformation. The tension between obedience and conscience, hierarchy and personal conviction. Over time, the structures built to defend and unify reshaped those they governed, at home as much as abroad. Hierarchy and doctrine replaced the personal conviction English religious thinkers had once pushed for, while ideals of liberty were subordinated to the need for control. The personal was absorbed into the political. It was here, in this collision of ideology and identity, that the seeds of an inverted reformation were sown, a reversal of the promise of personal liberty and faith. Instead, the empire increasingly demanded loyalty to a higher order. Not God this time, but the state itself. Blinded by the panic of warfare, the nation lost sight of what it had once hoped to defend. Amid this existential fog, British soldiers clung to what they still recognised. Symbols, stories and saints offered a fragile tether to meaning amid the endless churn of trench life. Britannia, even St. George, fragments of an older world were summoned as if they could stitch together the exhausted, dislocated men at the edge of survival. Here, as heroism began to crumble, St. George returned. Literally, a warrior saint, not just to inspire victory, but to make sense of senselessness. In the early weeks of the war, rumours spread of a miracle at Mons. Soldiers claimed they'd seen phantom archers, ghostly bowmen led by St. George himself, rising through the smoke to strike down the advancing Germans. The story traced back to a fictional tale by Arthur Machen published in a London paper, but it quickly took on a life of its own. Nurses, soldiers and spiritualists swore to its veracity. St. George had returned, a divine echo of Agincourt, conjured when England needed him most. A field nurse, Phyllis Campbell, recalled a Lancashire Fusilier asking for a picture of St. George because he had seen him on a white horse leading the British at Vitry-le-François. Another soldier remembered a cloud of light clearing to reveal a tall man in golden armour on a white horse, his mouth open as if he was saying, "Come on boys, I'll put the kibosh on the devils." Real or not, The English imagination had summoned its warrior saint once more, but no miracle could shield them from the brutal reality waiting on the front lines. On St George's Day 1915, the Northumberland Fusiliers wore their red roses with pride, but pride couldn't hold back the horrors of war. Just days later, after word of the chlorine gas unleashed at Ypres, they led their own charge near St Julien. Jack Dorgan, one of the Fusiliers that day, recounted the horror. Our eyes were streaming with water and with pain. All we had was a roll of bandages. Lines and lines of British soldiers going back with rolls of bandages round their eyes. Throughout England's history, the cult of St George had grown in the shadow of war. And now more than ever, the old symbols were summoned harder, louder, more urgently. People still needed to believe in what they were fighting for. 3 years later, on the eve of St George's Day 1918, those who fought held on to the old language of heroism as best they could. A strategic mission to neutralise the ports of Zeebrugge and Ostend. Vice Admiral Keyes invoked the ancient battle cry, St George for England, when he ordered the attack, and Captain Carpenter of the HMS Vindictive responded, "May we give the Dragon's Tail a damn good twist." While the raid itself achieved little in the way of tactical advantage, the press and public hailed it as a triumph. Here, as with Mons and the visions of St George, the symbolic weight eclipsed the harsh realities. Courage was celebrated, mythologized and codified through medals and speeches. Even when the outcome was ambiguous, costly or outright futile, the ritual remained. But in a war of tanks and trenches, for many on the front lines, like those at Ypres, the meaning was already slipping. Roses wilted, the gas kept coming, and the dragon, now mechanical, would not be slain so easily. For those who survived, words became the only arms that they could wield to make sense of the experience. A different kind of arsenal that exposed the truth behind the rhetoric. While propaganda had turned words into weapons at home, soldiers at the front took up their pens to carve meaning from the chaos. And in the poetry and art that followed, honest and unflinching, a cultural awakening began. Much more than words on a page, these works remain some of the clearest and most vivid windows we have into not only what the soldier endured, but what was lost when he returned. If he returned. At the start of the war, death still held a kind of grace. Rupert Brooke's poetry is often remembered for its romantic idealism, a vision of a world still untouched by gas or shell shock. But beneath the patriotism lies a quiet sorrow. In The Soldier, he writes, "If I should die, think only this of me, that there's some corner of a foreign field that is forever England." There is pride in his words, but also mourning, the anonymity of the soldier's lot, buried far from home, far from the world that made him who he was. A portrait of the casualties of international warfare, showing just how far removed the fight had become. Brooke died of sepsis en route to Gallipoli, before the grind of battle could shatter this vision. His work became symbolic of an innocence preserved in amber, one that would not survive the war. Those who lived long enough to see the battlefield firsthand found a darker voice in Wilfred Owen. He watched as Powell's battalions vanished in single mornings, and with them the illusions of a generation. In Anthem for Doomed Youth, he strips war of ritual. What passing bells for these who die as cattle. No prayers, no candles, only boys consumed by a contraption that barely noticed they were ever there. In Dulce et Decorum Est, Owen recalls a gas attack, much like Ypres, a man too slow to fix his mask. In all my dreams, before my helpless sight he plunges at me, guttering, choking, drowning. There's no beauty in this death, no sacred cause. The poem ends with accusation, denouncing the old lie. Dulce et decorum est, pro patria mori. And another voice cut through the bitter chorus. Siegfried Sassoon, a decorated officer who turned his rage not on the enemy, but on those behind the lines. The general exposes cheerful incompetence. They, the cold detachment of the church. Those who preached sacrifice rarely bore the cost. And in Suicide in the Trenches, he lashes out at those who cheered from the sidelines. I knew a simple soldier boy who grinned at life in empty joy, slept soundly through the lonesome dark, and whistled early with the lark. In winter trenches, cowed and glum, with crumps, and lice and lack of rum. He put a bullet through his brain. No one spoke of him again. You smug-faced crowds with kindling eye who cheer when soldier lads march by. Sneak home and pray you'll never know the hell where youth and laughter go. Like Owen, Sassoon's fury deepened with every loss. He considered the real betrayal not just strategic, but moral. Everyone who repeated the old lie had blood on their hands. Despite Sassoon's pleas, Owen returned to the front. In 1918, just months before his death, his life cut short one tragic week before the armistice. He asked a bigger question. Not how we die, but why we ever live at all. In one of his final poems, Futility, a dead soldier lies in the snow. Move him into the sun. Gently its touch awoke him once. If anything might rouse him now, the kind old sun will know. Until the closing lines collapsed the whole project of civilization. Was it for this the clay grew tall? Or what made fatuous sunbeams toil to break earth's sleep at all? Even the sun, that ancient symbol of life, hollowed out beneath the shellfire, creation itself reduced to cosmic accident. Over time, the trauma did not remain contained within the fields of Europe. Across the Atlantic, writers like Ernest Hemingway would confront the same loss of meaning, translating the war into a new, godless reality. These writings weren't acts of rebellion. They were reports, dispatches from the underworld. The message was clear. Behind the posters and patriotic pomp, there was no glory, no trial of saints, only mud, bureaucracy, and the stench of unburied men. They did more than mourn a generation. They unwrote a civilization's myths. Honor, sacrifice, patriotism, words that no longer made sense. What died in the trenches wasn't just the English soldier, it was the symbolic order itself. Those who returned did not come home to the England they had left. They came back haunted by memory, by guilt, and by traumas not yet named. The poetry of the war revealed the depth of that rift, the gulf between the horror faced at the front and the life that waited behind. Families struggled to understand one another. Society tried to move forward while carrying a silence it couldn't articulate. These fractures went beyond loss. They shattered the old illusions of honor and glory, leaving behind a broken generation. But in times of ruin, even the disillusioned turned to symbols to pull them through. And perhaps it's telling the ones they choose. St. George was in a fragile state. He had been for centuries. By the final months of the war, it was a small miracle that he was remembered at all. But he was. On the 23rd of April 1918, after nearly 4 years of a war that had stripped heroism to its bones, another voice rose above the desolation. John Masefield, England's poet laureate, on a lecture tour in America rallying support for the British cause, he reached for myth to articulate what ordinary language could not. He hadn't fought, but he honoured the dogged resolve of his fellow countrymen. St. George went out, I think, as the battalions of our men went out, a little trembling and a little sick and not knowing much about it, except that it had to be done. It was a flicker of legend in a world that had lost any right to believe in saints. For Masefield, St. George was no longer the triumphant knight of banners and processions. He was a symbol of endurance, of men marching into the furnace, afraid and uncertain, bound only by duty and fellowship. Where Owen and Sassoon confronted horror head-on, through legend, Masefield revealed an encouraging truth, that courage survives even when glory is gone. Months later, when the guns finally fell silent, the nation exhaled. On the 11th of November, David Lloyd George told the House of Commons, "This is no time for words. Our hearts are too full of gratitude to which no tongue can give adequate expression." The relief was tangible. A nation long starved of celebration now offered its joy and its sorrow together. Flags were hoisted, church bells rang. King George V addressed the cheering masses with measured gravity. Amidst our rejoicing, let us not forget to render humble thanks to Almighty God for the success with which it has pleased him to crown our arms. Rather than triumph, he offered gratitude, the voice of a nation sobered yet resolute. searching for meaning in a world it now needed to rebuild. For ordinary people, the armistice meant hopes of homecoming, reunion, and the quiet work of beginning again. For the nation at large, it also meant a moment of truth. Victory had come, but so had the cost. Buildings still stood, empires still spanned oceans, but the old myths had carried England as far as it seemed they could. The weight of the new world was more than they were built to bear. By the time the war ended, over 700,000 British soldiers were dead. Millions more returned home changed, haunted by what they experienced. And somewhere in the churned soil of no man's land, the figure of St. George, not long revived, seemed to vanish once more into the smoke. This video began with a simple question. How was England led into the Great War? Looking back, the answer lies in centuries of parliamentary power and in the prime ministers and cabinets who wielded it, bound by international treaties, domestic pressures, and the demands of sustaining the largest empire the world had ever known. But politics and strategy don't tell the whole story. The deeper thread is one of symbols, the saint, the flag, and a national spirit poised to return, only to be broken and reforged in the trenches. Legends had long shaped how nations understood war, a divine contest of wills, a proving ground of courage and faith. But in the mud of the Somme, those narratives cracked. Many called it the war to end all wars. But as we know, it didn't. What it did end was the illusion of certainty, the gilded facade of empire, and perhaps most importantly, the romanticized ideal of sacrifice. The tales didn't vanish, but they lost their power to explain. A symbolic world had become procedural, the individual reduced to a statistic, buried beneath ledgers and reports that eroded the human foundations on which the myths themselves relied. In Britain, the machinery of state could still govern, fight, and function. The empire persisted, and the union held, but the narrative that bound them, England's story, had been sidelined, and before long that sidelining embedded itself firmly into Britain's structure. The England of legend, the land of saints, martyrs, and kings, had become something of a ghost. Where saints once mediated a person's connection to the divine, the imperial system now mediated their connection to the nation. The Englishman's relationship to his homeland, his history, and his heritage was no longer immediate, but refracted through layers of bureaucracy, global obligation, and abstract duty. The stories of home filtered through the imperial lens and reshaped to serve its needs. In a desperate bid to maintain a sense of unity and power, England increasingly imposed its will, while an actively suppressed Ireland became a mirror to England's own internal repression. And Brooke's image of the Englishman whom England bore, shaped, made aware, was already becoming distant memory. The intimate bond to soil and story had been displaced by something far more remote. This created a subtle but profound vacancy in the English consciousness. The disillusionment of the country's modernist literature, satire, and art exposed a society searching inward for meaning where inherited myth once supplied it. Pride remained, but it stood apart from the stories and symbols that had once given it substance. Symbols like St. George, still present, yet oddly estranged from the nation he had once defended. Like the spirit of those who bore the brunt of battle, he was reforged, bent to a new purpose. Through the trauma of the war, the world would never be the same, and neither would the way the nation understood itself. St. George no longer promised victory over the dragon, only the courage to walk out and face it. In that, he became the mirror for a new kind of hero, not the triumphant knight, the soldier, stepping forward because someone had to. After the war, myth no longer glorified strength, it began to sanctify suffering. The faint echo of a martyr England had once known. And when the soldiers finally returned, they did so as wounded healers, their scars speaking for a generation that had seen too much. The dragon may have fallen in 1918, but so did the knight. Yet, in the hearts of the brave, he lived on, trading his horse for a tank, his lance for a rifle, his halo for a tin hat. Join me in part 5 as we explore how England remembered the Great War in silence, stone, and ritual, and how the knight returned to the nation's imagination, shaping the stories and ideals of a generation of young squires still growing up in the shadow of war. Thanks for watching. See you in the next video.